His question is, why are we debating term limits today? And he correctly points out, we're debating term limits today, even though I'm not sure our measure will pass, and there are Republicans who will join in opposition to term limits. I think I can peel back the curtain a bit. In January, during the speaker contest, there were a group of us who wanted to change the way Washington, D.C. operates. That meant changing the spending, that meant advancing balanced budgets, that meant getting House conservatives on committees of great import, but it also meant taking a vote on term limits. We required it. Speaker McCarthy agreed to it. For the last 8 months, he's been in breach of that agreement. And just weeks ago, I took to the floor of the House to serve notice of that breach, to inform Speaker McCarthy that if he did not hold a vote on term limits, which we will have today, that he would face a motion to vacate. Well, it seems that those remarks may have animated Speaker McCarthy, because here we are taking this vote. And while I acknowledge it may not pass, what even the opponents of term limits must acknowledge is that term limits are wildly popular in every zip code in America except 202, the Washington, D.C. zip code. You go to almost any place in the country, throw a rock on Main Street. Chances are 8 and 10, it's going to hit somebody who's in favor of term limits. But politicians aren't. I want to address some of the reasons why I think term limits would give us better government. And I'm one of the members here who served in both systems. And I will acknowledge that both systems have benefits and drawbacks. But in a term limits environment, you get more fresh ideas. Far too often in Washington, D.C., we revert to a failed and often corrupt muscle memory on how to do things, because you got a lot of people here who've been doing them for 10, 20 years, sometimes even longer. So people who are not beholden to the Washington way of thinking will naturally have a more dynamic manner in which to come up with fresh ideas. Second, I think it creates a stronger connection to the district. If the district is generating a new person every 6 years, then you don't have people who move to Washington, who make their lives in Washington. It becomes temporary, more like the true intent of our founders. And third, I'll use a sports analogy. I don't think anybody would ever like to watch a basketball game without a shot clock. You'd see people just dribbling around, holding the ball, never making a move, never having to present aggressive defense. And that kind of feels like how we've been governing for the last several decades. We just govern by omnibus bill and continuing resolution. And so if you have a shot clock, if you know that you get 6 years in the House, may go on to the Senate for a little bit more public service, but 6 years in the House, that's going to force people to actually compromise more, to take half a loaf. And by the way, I know that having been in that system. When I was in the state legislature, if there was an issue I cared a lot about, maybe animal welfare, cannabis reform, I would be willing to take less than what was perfect, because I knew I only had a certain amount of time there to contribute to that process, and I wanted to make, I wanted to be directionally correct in terms of the policies of our state. Here, increasingly, you have some of these folks who've seemingly been around since dirt was young, and it doesn't unlock that sense of urgency that oftentimes can lead to more productive government. There is a reason most of our states have term limits. It's because most of the people want it. And in states that have term limits, you have higher frequency of balanced budget. I think you don't have the endemic corruption that we often see in Washington, D.C., and you're not as lashed to the special interests. Like, in a term limits environment, the special interests and lobbyists can't really buy a lawmaker. They can only rent them for 6 years. And then they have to re-engage that process. And it kind of makes it tougher on the corrupt lobbyists and special interests. But in our system, they buy the cow and spend the rest of their time getting the milk for free. And that might be the reason why we're seeing such opposition to term limits now. I believe we can have open, honest, transparent government, and we will have this vote, not because it's a comfortable thing for a lot of people to take it, because people are going to be taking a vote that is on the opposite side of like 80% of the country when they vote against this.
Will the gentleman yield?
We'll have that vote. Sure, I'll yield, Mr. Ivey.
How many terms have you served?
Oh yeah, I'll get to that. I served 3 terms, but here's the deal. A lot of us who've served that amount of time, we actually want to shorten our own sentence, but we don't think our district should have to unilaterally disarm. Right? I think that tell you what, if we could get universal term limits.
Will the gentleman yield?
Well, I'm afraid I'm out of time, but I'd love to continue the conversation.
There's nobody else in your district who's capable of serving in
Many more,
Congress
probably far more capable than me. The voters did send me here to the tune of 70% of the vote, but I do think that if everyone had the same standard, we all live, I mean, like, you can't really be advocating for us living by different rules in different districts. Let's just all live by the same rules. I yield back.
Retire whenever you like.
Gentleman's time has expired.
You'd like that, wouldn't you?
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Cohen.